Okay, so we've made it to the third chapter in this course, which is on acids and bases. And so, I think you all have pretty good familiarity with what acids and bases are, some intuition. The first way that these were distinguished was simply by observing some of their physical properties. Probably the most noteworthy is taste and feel, right? Acids tend to taste very sour. Think about lemon juice. And things that are alkaline or basic tend to be slippery and taste pretty bitter. Obviously, tasting chemicals is kind of a thing of a past, other than our chemicals in food. We do that all the time. But there's this pH scale, of course, that tells you the strength of acids and bases relative to one another. And we think about on the scale, pH 7 is defined as being completely neutral. Okay, things that are larger than 7, generally up to 14, that those are things that are basic, and then down to 0 are things that are acidic. So that's sort of the basics of acids and base using the pH scale. When we think about what causes something to be an acid, the first thing we think about is generating a proton. And so you could write that as H plus. That's one way, the hydrogen ion, right, a proton. But really a better description is the hydronium ion, H3O plus. So that H plus, a proton by itself, H plus, isn't very stable. It's going to want to associate with something, and there's lots of water around, so it's going to be H3O plus. So you can think about two molecules of water, for example, disassociating into hydronium ion, which would be acidic, and a hydroxide ion, which would be basic. The reality is that this is actually still an oversimplification. Probably the predominant species is more like something like this, H9O4 plus instead of a hydronium ion. How does this work? Well, you have a hydronium ion, H3O plus in the center, and that's sort of interacting very strongly, or we can say coordinating with 3 additional water molecules. So you have these hydrogen bonds. And then protons can kind of transfer through these adjacent water molecules very quickly. So you can imagine, this bond breaks and you form this bond to make a hydronium ion. And this is how chemists usually think about proton hopping. But this is actually quite a complicated field, and still there's a lot of fundamental questions to be answered about this, depending upon kind of the conditions or what other things are in your solution. Like if you have a really concentrated salt, you could have different species here, okay? And so people try to model these things by computing them or doing different experiments. The experiments that are used are typically very fast. So you can see the title of this publication I pulled up, femtosecond and temperature-dependent picosecond dynamics, right? So these are processes, these breaking and making of hydrogen bonds are processes that occur really, really rapidly, but are very complex. But this is part of the reason why water is so good at making, at transferring protons, okay? So sort of one of the most basic definitions of what an acid and a base are, it's called the Bronsted definition. And this definition, it's very proton-centric. So a Bronsted acid is a proton donor. A Bronsted base is a proton acceptor. As we'll see later in this chapter, not all acids and bases have to have any protons in them. And so this is a narrow definition. It's not as fully encompassing of a definition as the Lewis acidity definition we'll talk about later in this chapter. But most of the bases and acids we deal with do involve proton transfer. So it's this definition is very useful for us. And so how you can think about this is if you have some species like hydrogen fluoride, okay, or hydrofluoric acid, it can react with the base, so in this case water, and it's going to make an acid, hydronium, right? We always said that hydronium ion is an acid. and a fluoride a base. And so why? Well, because this donated a proton to water, right? HF donated a proton to water, that's why it's an acid. Water is a base because it accepted a proton from HF. And a very similar thing here, because if we think about this reaction going both ways, and indeed, many of the times when we're talking about acids and bases, these processes are in equilibrium. They're not just fully going to completion. So if you think about hydronium ion, why would that be an acid? Well, it can donate a proton to fluoride and make HF, right? So it's a proton donor, Bronsted acid. And why would fluoride be a base? Because it's accepting a proton from hydronium. Okay, so we started with one acid and one base, and we ended up with the second acid and the second base. This is, basically this is what always happens. Okay, these type of reactions. Here's another example. This time where water is acting as an acid, okay, but we have a base, ammonia. And so why is water acting as an acid? Well, because it's going to be a proton donor. It donates a proton to the base, ammonia, which is a proton acceptor, to make ammonium ion, okay? And that is the acid. And then also hydroxide was formed, which is a base. Why is ammonium an acid? We can do the reaction in the reverse way. It can donate a proton to hydroxide and in the process make water. And why is hydroxide a base? Well, because it accepted a proton from ammonium. So this is the way to track whether or not you have a Bronsted acid or a base. So yes, in general, we're going to have acid 1 plus base 1 reacting with or in equilibrium with a second acid and a second base. We give this second acid and the second base, sometimes it's convenient to give them a special name. We call them the conjugate acid and the conjugate base. But because this is in equilibrium oftentimes, really you could write it conjugate acid plus conjugate base goes to acid 2 plus base 2. So it's completely arbitrary which one you call the conjugate acid and the conjugate base. It just means the other one. But what first one are you talking about? That's arbitrary, right? But still, it's useful to have the words the other one, the other acid, conjugate base, and the other base without saying that, with the corresponding base. So one thing you'll notice here is that, in these two expressions, we had the first one, water was a base, and the second one, water was an acid. And this, we give a special name when something can be an acid or a base. We call it amphoteric. So water can gain or accept protons, sorry. So we call water as amphoteric. It can be an acid or a base.